If you use the word very too much, I've got better words for you. Instead of saying very with an adjective word, try these powerful alternatives. Let's start. If you say very afraid, use fearful in place of that, or you can also use this as an alternative. If you say very angry, use furious in place of that. If you say very annoying, say exasperating in place of that. If you say very bad, use awful in place of that. If you say very beautiful, use gorgeous in place of that. If you say very big, use massive in place of that. If you say very boring, use dull in place of that. If you say very bright, say luminous in place of that. If you say very busy, use swamped in place of that. If you say very calm, use serene in place of that. If you say very careful, use cautious in place of that. If you say very cheap, use stingy in place of that. If you say very clean, use spotless in place of that. If you say very clear, say obvious in place of that. If you say very cold, use freezing in place of that. If you say very colorful, use vibrant in place of that. If you say very competitive, use cutthroat in place of that. If you say very complete, use comprehensive in place of that. If you say very difficult, use arduous in place of that. If you say very dirty, use filthy in place of that. If you say very dry, say arid in place of that. If you say very dull, use tedious in place of that. If you say very easy, use effortless in place of that. If you say very empty, use desolate in place of that. If you say very excited, say thrilled in place of that. If you say very exciting, use exhilarating in place of that. If you say very expensive, use costly in place of that. If you say very fancy, use lavish in place of that. If you say very fat, use obese in place of that. If you say very friendly, say amiable in place of that. If you say very frightened, use alarmed in place of that. If you say very frightening, say terrifying in place of that. If you say very funny, use hilarious in place of that. If you say very glad, use overjoyed in place of that. If you say very good, say excellent in place of that. If you say very great, use terrific in place of that. If you say very confused, use perplexed in place of that. If you say very creative, use innovative in place of that. If you say very crowded, use bustling in place of that. If you say very dangerous, use perilous in place of that. If you say very dear, use cherished in place of that. If you say very deep, use profound in place of that. If you say very depressed, use despondent in place of that. If you say very detailed, use meticulous in place of that. If you say very different, use disparate in place of that. If you say very happy, use ecstatic in place of that. If you say very hard, use difficult in place of that. If you say very hard to find, use rare in place of that. If you say very heavy, use leaden in place of that. If you say very high, use soaring in place of that. If you say very hot, use sweltering in place of that. If you say very huge, use colossal in place of that. If you say very hungry, use starving in place of that. If you say very hurt, use battered in place of that. So next time if you say very, switch to these stronger words instead. They'll make your English sound much more natural and impressive. Which one is your favorite? Comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to English Lovers by HoneyD. Like this video and share it with your friends so they can improve their English too.